The launch of any new processor generation brings with it a whole host of new motherboards on new chipsets with new features and connectivity, and Ryzen 9000 has been no different, with the launch of X870 and X870E. But against the lukewarm reception initially for Ryzen 9000 and future X3D chips expected in the not too distant future, what is there to know about X870 motherboards in general? And when it comes to deciding which one you should buy for your next build, what's the best choice? Well, we've had in a whole host of X870 boards at different form factors, price points, and with a range of different feature sets. And in this video, I'll be walking you through everything you need to know about buying an X870 motherboard. Let's do this. Take your build to the next level with ASUS sleek RGB DDR5 memory. Available with a wide range of speeds and capacities, the ASUS Panther lineup has a kit for everyone. A great looking aluminium alloy heatsink offers excellent heat dissipation, while Intel XMP 3.0 and AMD Expo certification means this RAM is a great fit for Team Red and Team Blue systems. Plus, RGB support in ASUS, Gigabyte, MSI, and ASRock software suites makes this an easy addition to any build. Learn more at the first link in the description below. I'm going to begin with some important context about these new X870 motherboards and the CPUs that go with them, before talking about top features you should look out for on these new boards, what the differences are between the X870E and non-E chipset derivatives, before looking at my favourite boards that you should consider buying. X870 is a natural evolution from X670, which is the chipset it looks to replace. Now, on all CPU lineups from AMD and Intel, you'll find a range of chipsets for each CPU generation. Last gen, for example, AMD had their X670, B650, and A620 chipset lineups. The higher the letter and number, the higher end that chipset is, and the more features you're likely to get. Now, it would be fair to say that the X670 chipset provided a pretty enormous step up from the X570 chipset it replaced. For the first time, we had PCI Gen 5 support for SSDs and in some cases GPUs, as well as the highest speed USB, networking, and Wi-Fi we'd ever seen on an AMD motherboard. An X870 looks to do the same, but in a more iterative way. Just as Ryzen 9000 CPUs aren't that much better than the Ryzen 7000 chips they replace, X870 kind of is in the same bracket, but it does bring a few important upgrades. Now, X870 will support Ryzen 9000 and Ryzen 7000 CPUs out of the box. X670 will only support newer Ryzen 9000 chips with a BIOS update. We're also expecting AMD to discontinue production of X670 boards, favouring the newer X870 counterparts. Now, as it stands, there are 4 different manufacturers at the moment to choose from initially. We've got Gigabyte, MSI, and ASUS. We also recently saw some press releases showing that NZXT will once again be bringing out motherboards for AMD CPUs, and I'd expect Intel's upcoming Core Ultra chips as well, but we're not expecting to see those until next year. And they don't tend to be a huge player in this space anyway. The main differences between X870 and X670 come from the PCI lanes derived from the CPU. Basically, we've got widespread PCI Gen 5 support for CPUs and GPUs for the first time. What that basically means is that every single X870 board, whether it's an E or a non-E derivative, has a Gen 5 slot for the NVMe and for the GPU. You may then be wondering, what are the differences between X870 and X870E in that case? The E boards just have a wider connectivity set in general, with more USB ports, bigger IOs, and more connectivity. Gen 5 isn't really the key differentiator this time around. Now, in terms of what top features you should look for on some of these boards, there are a few basic ones to point out. Wi-Fi 7 support is now more standard than it's ever been. That's going to give you a massive speed increase over Wi-Fi 6 and 6E. You will need a compatible router to take advantage of it, but it's a good feature to have. USB 4 support, providing up to 40 gigabits per second of bandwidth, is also widespread for the first time, with all of the boards supporting it. Now, some boards are going to have more than others, and we'll come on to that in a moment, while you'll also find that Gen 5 support as standard on the NVMe and the PCI slot. Now, we haven't yet seen what next-gen graphics cards look like. I'm talking about the likes of the 5090. However, I would absolutely expect PCI Gen 5 to be a prerequisite requirement of at least the top-end GPU. Maybe the 5080 will only need Gen 4. We're not sure yet, but it's a good feature to have. And remember, these boards, which support not only Ryzen 7 and 9000 chips, but AMD are going to support the AM5 socket through to at least 2027, do give you an element of future-proofing. So going for a board with all that connectivity can be really really important. Which brings me nicely onto my favourite choices on the X870 lineup. Now let's start with the cheaper end of the market and see what you can bag yourself for a lower end price point on the X870 lineup with MSI's X870-P Wi-Fi. Now barring one or two ASRock boards I saw on Newegg, this is about as cheap as you're going to get on the X870 chipset. And it is, straight away from what you can see, a pretty attractive looking but undoubtedly basic looking motherboard. Now where a board like this is going to make sacrifices is in a few key areas. The first is the VRM power phases. That's going to determine your leverage for overclocking in particular and the support you're going to have for those real top-end power-hungry CPUs. It's also going to determine the kind of I/O that you'll receive on the motherboard, and you can see that MSI have taken a more bare-bones approach that really ticks the minimum boxes for the X870 chipset. You can see there's only one USB-C 40 gigabit port, the rest are all USB 2s or standard USB 3 and 10 gigabit ports. It's still a fairly healthy I/O for most builds, but if you're looking to do content creation or just want to attach loads of high-speed peripherals, you don't have that option. Other key requisites, we've got things like no optical audio, but we do maintain Wi-Fi 7 support on the rear, but you do still retain on the front PCI Gen 5 support on the X16 slot and for the top NVMe. The rest are going to be PCI Gen 4 or Gen 3. Really what that means is if you want to build a gaming PC where you're getting the X870 features because you're particularly concerned about Gen 5 support for next-gen GPUs, or you just want a fairly affordable board that still has all of the key selling points of X870, this is not a terrible shout. It's just not going to offer you much by way of extra features or frills. Now, there are some nice things to report. You get a fully toolless NVMe installation, which is good to see, but we do lack any form of NVMe cooling on any of the additional Gen 3 or Gen 4 slots. Now, that's particularly problematic on higher-end drives, not only on the Gen 5, but the Gen 4 lineups too, which do need some form of additional cooling beyond the default drive that you're going to get out of the box. Interestingly, on lots of these boards, we're also seeing these supplementary 8-pin PCI power connectors. This is, as far as I'm aware, to again better enable the installation of next-gen GPUs, which may require that bit more power. This then a good option if you want a bare-bones board on the latest chipset, but don't expect particularly much by way of VRM power delivery. This board actually has less than MSI's last-gen X670 Tomahawk, or by way of fancy features. That's not to say, though, you have to spend a great deal more to get quite a bit more by way of features. And the ASUS TUF X870 plus Wi-Fi is a great example of that. Now, unlike the MSI board, which only has 14 VRM power phases, this actually has a 16 plus 2 plus 1 design, much better for power delivery generally and a bit more overclocking. Again, you retain the standard Gen 5 NVMe and Gen 5 PCI slots, but this time you gain a second Gen 5 NVMe slot. Personally, for me, having the ability to add 2 Gen 5 SSDs in is a massive plus and something that's going to make an enormous difference. The I/O is still a little more basic, but crucially, you get a second USB 40 gigabit port, a little bit more as far as I/O is concerned, and the rest is very, very similar. But this board isn't going to cost you a huge amount more, and for me personally, it looks a lot better. It's a more substantial design, most definitely, and you do get cool quality of life features, like of course this easy release for the GPU, and a slightly stronger array of things like USB headers, extra fan headers. There's loads of fan headers on this ASUS board, which is amazing to see. And of course, this board is a slightly more gaming-oriented design generally, and will fit better in some builds. Perhaps my favourite X870 board, though, when it comes to a really good value design and a wide feature set, has to be this, the Gigabyte Aorus X870 Elite Wi-Fi 7. Now, this comes in at the UK at the time of filming at about £270, and the US dollar amount is actually surprisingly similar. And this continues a trend from Gigabyte of making some absolutely phenomenally good value for money motherboards. I could list to you now 5 or 6 boards from their B650 and X670 lineup that offered extraordinary price to performance ratios. Now, this board actually boasts the best VRM support of any of the two I've looked at so far, with 16 plus 2 plus 2 power phases, and quality of life features on this motherboard are frankly fantastic. Take, for example, this fully toolless NVMe area here, one little notch, and the whole thing pulls off, and here you'll actually see a multitude of NVMe connections. Again, we have a pair of Gen 5 NVMe slots, which are really well labelled, and fully toolless installation across all three with these little tabs that are really easy to use. Compared to some of the other boards, we've also got an extra X16 length slot at the bottom. They're not both going to run at full X16 bandwidth, as well as, of course, the main X16 slot at the very top, with again this nice little button which allows you to easily release the graphics card once it's been installed. Arguably the only real weak point is the Ethernet, which is half as quick as what you'll find on the MSI board, but this is the first design to have an optical audio output. Like the ASUS board, it's got 2 USB 4 connections, so that's again 40 gigabits of bandwidth. We have got slower USBs to make up the numbers, but plenty of USB 3.2 ports with all of their bandwidth, and overall I actually think the design of this board looks the best when all things are considered. And of course, look how easy the NVMe heatsink is. Take notes, guys, Gigabyte have got this absolutely spot on. Other cool features as well to note include the Q-code display, which allows for really easy debugging. Nice work, Gigabyte. That's a feature you have to spend more money to get on both the MSI and the ASUS boards, making this a real firm favourite of mine. But what if you've got a little bit more money to spend? What are the options that are going to offer you more features, more connectivity, and just generally better board designs? Well, I've picked out 3 to look at here. The Carbon, which I really like, the ProArt, which I think is probably the best board for particular use cases, and the ASUS Crosshair, which is going to be a better option all round for overclocking. Now let's start off with the Carbon. You can see how MSI have taken the features on this board up significantly. Not only have we got toolless NVMe for the Gen 5 slot at the top, but additionally for those extra NVMe slots too, we also have a fully toolless installation design, both in terms of the heatsink and in terms of these little nubbins which are going to secure the drive down. These toolless mechanisms have got so easy nowadays. I remember when I first tried out one of these and was like, yeah, it's okay. Now it literally couldn't be any more simple. Look at that. You'll start to see certain features crop up on these higher-end boards. We've got power and reset physical switches. That's really useful when it comes to actually debugging, if you've not quite got your JFP working right, or you want to build more of a test bench before moving into the case. I/O generally on this board is a lot better, where we also have a Q-code debug display and Q-code LEDs. This has got significantly better VRM power phases and cooling than a lot of the cheaper boards out there, and just the heatsinks alone are a good telltale sign that that's the case, as well as shielding on not 1 but 2 of the PCI X16 slots. Both of these slots, by the way, are PCI Gen 5. The top one has a really nice lock and unlock mechanism. Unlike the others where you press to release, this is like on or off, which I actually think is slightly easier to understand. Well, you do get 2 Gen 5 NVMe slots. The first one is under the cover I removed earlier. The second just below, while the final 2 are still Gen 4, so plenty of room for super high-speed storage. Some of the I/O is actually on the side of the board as well, including the USB 3 Type-C and 2 USB-A ports, while the overall board just looks, in my opinion, a whole load better. Moving over to the other side of the boards, Crosshair Hero board's going to be the best shout when it comes to overclocking. It's got all the fancy features you might need. Now, this doesn't make sense if you're buying a Ryzen 5 or even Ryzen 7. This is going to be reserved for the 9900 and 9950X and potential X3D top-end chips we'll see later on. You retain some of those key features I pointed out on the MSI board, start and reset. You also have like a mem OK button, which is really good for getting those Expo kits working. Side-mounted and bottom-mounted I/O, giving you loads of options. Connectivity galore. You can see again, ASUS have got this fully toolless NVMe installation for the top slot. The lower slots are held on by screws, which I think could be a little more intuitive, but is still okay. With again a pair of armored PCI Gen 5 slots. These have got their own easy GPU removal, which I like to see, and a really fantastic I/O at the back with a 5 gigabit Ethernet, a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, loads of USB 4 with 40 gigs of bandwidth, stacks and stacks of connectivity here. ASUS's ProArt is for a slightly different audience and is my board recommendation for those of you looking to do content creation. Now, ProArt is a brand that when ASUS first launched it, I was a little undecided about. Now I fully get it. The connectivity, you get extra PCI slots on this board, perfect for adding in sound cards, different expansion cards that a creator is going to leverage more while still having dual GPUs. Something you just wouldn't do for gaming, but may make sense for things like content creation in apps like DaVinci Resolve and Blender. The I/O on this board is pretty nuts with 10 gigabit Ethernet natively, a 2.5 gig Ethernet, a pair of USB 4 ports, and the rest are still super high speed 10 gigabit USB Type A. Real emphasis here on the number of USB ports. Well, things like VRM cooling and power phases are good, but not exactly the main priority at a board that is aimed at this particular target market. It's also worth giving a bit of an honorable mention to one of the ITX boards in the current X870 stack. This is going to be a great fit for those of you looking to build a small form factor build while still giving you lots of the features and connectivity. The I/O on the rear is pretty decent. We've got 2.5 gig Ethernet, USB Type-C, 40 gigabit for 2 of the ports. We've got a pair of those with DisplayPort connections too. And one thing that ASUS has done really well on this board is actually built up the PCB, adding lots of extra expansion vertically to make up for the small ITX form factor of the design. It's very typical as well to see NVMe slots on the bottom or the undersides of these boards, and yet this nice shielding too, which is going to help protect the board in those much smaller form factor systems. So then, they're my recommendations for X870 boards you should consider, and you can find full reviews of all of them linked at GeekaWhat.com in the description below. no, but is X870 actually worth it? Now, as it stands, pricing on X870 boards hasn't been as bad as I'd expected. And while I wouldn't say they're an enormous step change from X670, things like widespread USB 4 support and Gen 5 for the NVMe and GPU is really important. And I've been impressed on how many of these boards, not just the most expensive designs, actually have good Gen 5 support for more than one NVMe. That, I think, is the most important takeaway from these new designs. Now is also a great time to bag yourself a deal on X670. Those boards are cheaper than ever and only going to drop in price in the coming weeks. But as far as the transition to X870 goes, I think so far I've been pretty impressed. And I think it does make sense for the vast majority of you guys out there looking to build a high-end Ryzen PC, especially when X3D launches, hopefully in the next few weeks or months at the latest. What's your guys' favourite board? Let me know in the comments below. Make sure to get subscribed if you enjoyed this one. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.